All right, thank you everyone for coming to the talk Why Global Food System Failure is One of the Biggest Threats to Humanity and What We Can Do About It. Before I start, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so these can be submitted through Swapcard on the event through live discussion. So get your questions in during the talk. A quick introduction to Noah. Noah Wescombe specializes in technical capacity building and strategy for systemic physical risks to humanity and wears a couple of professional hats for this. As a strategic advisor to AllFed, working on extreme food system risk from various neglected angles, which he'll be speaking about today, and as an analyst for UNPRI, where they work on climate physical risk. So over to you, Noah.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining today. Appreciate your interest in a topic and perhaps a title that I engineered to be provocative. Although I do have quite a lot of confidence that this is the case, and I'll tell you why. But I'm acutely aware that some people still don't know too much about what AllFed does. People have heard about us, heard about the organization. We've been around for a few years now in the EA space. But still, I think everyone could benefit from learning a little bit more in the details about what we do and why the issues we focus on are particularly important for risks to humanity, potential existential risks is included in that. So the technology works. That's great. So overall, just an introduction to AllFed in general, if you haven't heard about us. The general AllFed mission, AllFed stands for the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters. And we help create resilience to global catastrophic sort of food shocks. And we continue priority research projects in resilient foods in particular as an area for this. So particular foods that will be resilient to these kinds of scenarios that we focus on. I'll come to those scenarios in a moment. So conduct resilient food pilots. So pilots for these new technologies we want to integrate into our global resilience strategies and support governance and response organizations in their ability to respond to these kinds of events globally and also enact responsiveness and preparedness plans in local contexts and country contexts as well. And that will also link to some policy-related work that we are doing at the moment. You could perhaps coin this sort of effective food systems lobbying, which I can speak a little bit about. So what would essentially cause a food shock? So since sort of local disasters can generally you could say cause sort of a 1% food shock in general. These are sort of generally the kinds of ones you hear about in the news that occur on sort of a year-on-year basis or on sort of chronic bases. And these are sort of, lots of other organizations already focus on these kinds of risks. So this is not something that AllFed is supposed to be really focusing most of its time on. It's more the case that we try and ally ourselves with relevant organizations where relevant. We have contacts at the FAO, it's UN Food and Agricultural Organization. We keep up to speed with what relevant governments are doing at the Ministry of Agriculture levels and other NGOs who work in the sort of response and emergency capacity building space. But ultimately, our focus is more upon the 10% plus shock. So this is where global food supply could be curtailed by 10% or more, including capability for it to actually disrupt civilization, human civilization as we know it. And you can see here the way in which we sort of look at this sort of relates to the different kinds of global disaster scenarios that we have. So obviously looking at volcanic eruptions, extreme weather events, asteroid impacts, looking at different crop diseases, abrupt climate change is included in this, although its potential to disrupt on more than a 10% basis is somewhat controversial. And looking across these areas, including pandemics now as well, supply chain disruptions, etc. This is an area that's really getting a lot of traction and global interest right now. So that's one of the reasons why we're sort of scaling up the stakeholder engagement we have in some of these areas, such as policy. So to go into a little bit more depth on the kind of scenarios, I'll just give a bit of an overview on the likely sort of scenarios that could cause this. And how this relates to the key argument I'm making here, that this is really something that everybody should be concerned about, particularly where you understand you most likely understand or are aware of some of the biggest risks to humanity, existential risks, from biorisk, AI, etc. You name it, these issues are serious and are ones that EAs are very concerned about. But what we don't focus on so much is the idea that these kinds of scenarios could lead to full-scale food system collapse. And this is particularly concerning for the way in which key bread baskets could be disrupted. So when we talk about the levels of food supply in total, we're also focusing and honing in on the specific nutritional requirements needed to sustain healthy human populations. So as you might be aware, we sort of need a minimum of 1,500 calories per day as human beings to sustain ourselves over sort of medium to long term. Medium term as in if we had a nuclear winter scenario, for example, where we had large amounts of soot covering the sky, due to a massive sort of fallout scenario as a result of sort of international conflict around nuclear weapons, then this could release a lot of soot into the atmosphere. Basically, we wouldn't have the sunlight and as we would normally have it for a period of up to 5 years. And also global precipitation, so rainfall could be severely disrupted as well. We're expecting sort of up to sort of a 10-degree drop in global average temperature as a sudden climate disruption. And this is not something we talk about so much on climate change. We have very few models that try and adequately model this, figure out what the actual impacts on the biodiversity is going to be, what are the impacts on soil, what are the impacts on water quality and water recharge rates around the world. These sorts of elements are really important for food system stability, and we sort of take them for granted most of the time because the chronic shifts we see in climate change are sort of gradual, and although there's a lot of panic around the climate crisis, we are not so concerned about some of these scenarios which could cause a sudden change in the temperatures of the Earth, reduction in the temperatures, and a reduction in the amount of water available to feed those crops. Across these different scenarios, we also look at the interdependency of these risks as well and the potential compounding effects of these risks. So as we've seen with the Ukraine crisis, plus the pandemic, that's already caused major problems with food prices. What if we had a situation that was many times worse than that, where we had sort of 2 or 3 crises working in tandem, also making economic disruption much worse? Governments are unable to respond to that. Even if it wasn't a global disruption that would threaten the future of humanity, it may be that billions of people could be affected. Billions of people could not be able to afford food effectively, could go hungry, could suffer from malnutrition, etc. And this is an area where we want to make sure we're accounting for those different eventualities in relation to these different scenarios. And the thing the UK government report I've just highlighted here does make the claim that there's an 80% probability this century of a greater than 10% food shortfall. This is due to compounding weather events, extreme weather around the world. And this is specifically towards those bread baskets that are most exposed to those, by the way, just to caveat that. So certain bread baskets are more exposed to the effects of extreme climate, induced weather changes and weather shocks. So if these compounded within a century across different regions, which is actually quite likely, we could see sort of an up to 80% probability of a 10% food shortfall. So that's something we need to think about, but it's not something that AllFed focuses on for the majority of its time. We focus somewhat towards the more sort of 80%, sort of 60 to 80% shock range. What if we lost most of the food we have? And one element I just want to hone in on very briefly here, as a key area we've been doing some related policy work on recently, is abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios. As I just mentioned on the nuclear winter example, what if soot covered the sun? What if we had reduced precipitation as a result and had to try and grow food? Obviously, supervolcanoes and asteroids can also cause global winters in this way. But we've done some relevant modelling around this in relation to the different sort of severities of nuclear war we could expect. So here we're sort of looking at sort of the predicted growing conditions effects of a 150 teragram nuclear winter scenario. And as you can see, in relation to the surface temperature changes, over time, you're sort of seeing that the total precipitation is fully out of whack. We've got significant changes there. The surface temperature has quite dramatic changes. And sort of the understanding how that impacts sort of solar flux surface, so actual solar radiation, the radiation of the sun that's getting to the Earth's surface and feeding crops for effective photosynthesis is dramatically reduced, particularly in certain regions. And this would obviously be most impactful to the equatorial regions and sort of the tropical regions. So many of the areas we look at for food systems sort of resilience are towards those areas where there's less preparedness in the food system for these kinds of changes. Also worth mentioning, though, that the areas that are still cold already, these are places that don't necessarily, you have like winter wheat, for example. We look at these kinds of crops in AllFed, where we're looking at certain types of crops that would be most suitable to winter scenarios, and these are often grown in the sort of certain regions of the world. So we're looking at the higher altitude areas. We're sort of looking at the more, I suppose. We looked at Australia, for example, UK, parts of the US that grow these most effectively. So the more temperate environments is the word I'm looking for, the temperate climates that most suitable for these kinds of crops. But you still see a large disruption overall. That's the main point here in available caloric change across these different sort of teragram scenarios. The biggest obviously being 150. Obviously you can see 5 to 16 teragrams is less severe, so it does make a significant impact. And obviously it's important to note that with the 150 teragram scenario, there's a great deal more uncertainty baked into that model and the parameters for that than with the lower teragram scenarios. But it's important to just bear these curves in mind in terms of the types of shocks we're looking at and the impacts. And some of the sort of cost effectiveness elements we've done as well around this are also important to note. So we're expecting sort of an expected mortality of approximately 500 million for a 10% shortfall in food supply. And also considering the sort of different interventions we can generate around this, we're sort of looking at sort of a $100 million sort of requirement to actually fund the solutions that we want to achieve at AllFed. So this is kind of quite seems like a lot of money, but at a global level, this is pennies. It's really just cheap change for what we could achieve with the kinds of food systems profiling that we've done. And it's also the idea that we want to try and generate an acceleration of these kinds of technologies, so we can save potentially expected sort of lives saved of around up to 40,000 per day on these kinds of solutions. So that's a really big savings component that we've sort of achieved. There's uncertainties again in these estimates, so don't take them too seriously. But we want to sort of emphasize that this is quite a significant savings, perhaps compared to other solutions that you might look at. And so I would just want to briefly cover resilient food solutions. I think we're doing okay for time, but we've got a lot we could cover in this. But in fact, before I do that, I just wanted to talk about the abrupt sunlight reduction scenario policy work that we've been doing, because that's slightly more important. I think something that will interest you guys more. You can look into our sort of resilient foods work separately. I'll cover it if I have time. But this is relevant to some of the abrupt sunlight reduction scenario policy work we've been doing, and I've been leading on some of that work, particularly around the US. So we've been looking at ways to build on the existing work we've been doing on abrupt sunlight reduction scenario planning. So we've generated country-level plans for the US and Australia currently, and the US plan that we've generated, we're currently trying to integrate into national legislation in some way. And we've been talking to sort of key stakeholders, key members of Congress to try and figure out if this is possible. There's an ongoing piece of legislation called the Farm Bill right now, which is quite relevant to the US context. Happens every 5 years, big omnibus piece of legislation. And we're trying to figure out, who could be the relevant champions for that in the US context. And the advantage of this is there's something called the GCRMA, or the Global Catastrophic Risk Mitigation Act in the US that's been passed last year, which is part of the NDAA. That's the National Defense Authorization Act. So everything to do with national defense, national security goes into the NDAA in the US. And now we've got something that explicitly says, which is a real victory for EAs, by the way, who care about existential and catastrophic risks. We've got something in legislation that says to US policymakers, you need to concern yourself with this. We need to figure out what these impacts look like, these risks look like, and how well we're prepared for them, what we can look at in terms of solution sets. So that's a really good start, and we're looking to build on that work through the work that we're trying to do in the US on the Farm Bill. yeah, but that's one element. We've also put another piece of a plan that's mostly focused on response capacity rather than preparedness and response. These are two different things that AllFed focuses on. We focus on the response capacity, sort of telling people what to do once it's occurred, once this say ASRS scenario has occurred. Whereas the preparedness piece is more around, what can you do to generate the technology solutions, the scale up trial, generate crop trials for the resilient foods we want to include. How can you, manage the trade situation, which could be a huge cause for concern. So all of these different elements we tried to pack into a response plan, which we've kind of put behind glass. So, break glass in emergency kind of situation for the Australian government. And we're lucky enough to have had that sort of that opportunity arose sort of in a sense due to our sort of networking and the people we knew there. But we're also trying to integrate this into other country contexts now as well. We're looking at Sweden and Finland in particular, who have existing infrastructure. They could use leftover from previous developments in the Cold War, post-Cold War, and during Cold War that they invested in. So whether there's the opportunity to trial this across different environments, different climates, is really something we're looking to explore further. But yeah, if you've got any further questions about that, I'm happy to answer those. That's just a big sort of lobbying piece that we're trying to undertake at the moment. And just to give you a good idea of what these different solutions look like. So we've got sort of seaweed, which we include as a key solution here, could cover a lot of caloric intake and is quite scalable, quite low cost to integrate. But this could probably generate up to sort of 10 to 20% of caloric intake because of the iodine content. So we're very cautious about this. But this is an area that's quite popular. We've also got sort of crop relocation strategies for existing crops. So these are still resilient foods, as I mentioned. So winter wheat, I mentioned previously. These are relevant to certain regions of the world where we can relocate to, so those higher latitudes, for example, or areas, bringing them down from the colder climates towards warmer climates to improve their yield potential and reduce their exposure to frost. We've got greenhouse solutions as well, which provide a sort of ability to protect from these kinds of unstable environments that we see and sort of improve the warmth, improve the humidity, because warmth and humidity obviously going to go down in the event of an ASRS scenario. So these are good solutions. And also sort of decentralized food production as well. So making sure that folks are able to utilize to the best effect possible solutions that they can home grow, that are sort of DIY, community-based, so they're not relying exclusively on food aid packages from sort of government-led initiatives that try and sort of dramatically scale up these industrially. So that we want to try and include that as well. There's also sort of these leaf protein concentrate that we look at, which is ways to get protein directly from leaves, which is quite useful for residues from agriculture, etc. Lots of feedstock for that. They're quite hard to scale up at the moment. Actually, it's surprisingly low tech. We've looked into this. And we also have sort of lignocellulosic sugar, so ways to get sugar from bark and other plant-based sources, which could be really very useful for overall caloric intake. So yeah, I'm going to sort of leave it there because I'm relatively out of time. I wanted to sort of open to questions. But yeah, overall, AllFed's scope is quite large, and we cover a bunch of different areas. But ultimately, you can probably see how some of these resilient food solutions fit into the ASRS planning piece, the ways in which you might want to scale that up over certain sectors, get certain government ministries and departments involved, get the funding down to achieve this, and really showcase that it's something that different countries around the world are ready for and can respond to. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noah. That was really interesting. Yeah, a reminder, you can put your questions in the swap card app under the event. Yeah, I've got a question. It's a question relating to the policy. I found that particularly interesting. One, have you had much success with UK legislators? And how open are these individuals? Do they take these threats seriously? In terms of, it can sound quite like the probability is quite low, even though the scale is really high. Do they conceptualize that?
Yeah, so the big challenge I think around the UK context is a few years ago we had something called the National Preparedness Commission, which did a bunch of stuff trying to figure out, is the UK resilient to the effects of a bunch of different scenarios, different risks that are posed to the UK economy, and one of those obviously critically was food. But nothing much has happened since that commission was produced. That was led on by a bunch of important folks, including folks from CSER. But yeah, this is something that we need to integrate more fully into our resilience strategy and our national security strategy. One problem with this additionally is the way in which our food system is constructed in the UK and where the money goes. So we don't have a very versatile food system in the UK, which means that we have less to work with than certain countries would, like Australia and the US, which can potentially feed people in disasters. So if the world came to a standstill or nobody else was able to produce crops, say Argentina, US, Australia, maybe China, if it keeps its borders open, would be really, really key actors to actually feed the world and provide those key exports. So those are the kind of countries we prioritize based on that. Hopefully that gives you a bit of context.
Yeah, that was great, thank you. We've got a question from Aidan. How likely do you think it is that we'll be possible to feed humanity in these kinds of scenarios without resorting to animal products, given you mentioned milk and fibre-eating insects?
Yeah, less than ideal for the vegans among us who are very don't feel very comfortable with these kinds of ideas. But unfortunately, in these kinds of scenarios, some of those go to the sort of wayside a little bit. They fall to the wayside, and we have to sort of prioritize where humans can best feed themselves under different circumstances. If we are, I admit the protein concentrate components would be particularly useful for this if we're able to generate. I mean, we just had a talk just now talking about alternative proteins in this very room. But if we're able to scale that up with low cost and with a sufficient stock to actually generate that, then that's fantastic. The utility of milk production in particular is that it is relatively resilient to these kinds of effects, so the weather effects, etc. Cows are relatively resilient and produce quite a lot of milk, although you do have to feed those cows. So one thing we do actually model in the modelling that we've done is slaughter, which is a piece that I was trying to leave out because this is quite ugly, but some of the ugly consequences of responding to these kinds of scenarios is that within about a year, you only get about a year of animal production in these 5-year scenarios of nuclear winter before you have to kill all the animals because you just can't feed them. And people need to eat those animals to survive and eat the food that those animals were eating. So unfortunately, this is not very animal welfare friendly. I do apologize for this. But if we had sufficient plans to scale up things that could replace those or could feed the animals at the same time or could scale down sufficiently the level of animal agriculture we could save some animals and give them better lives potentially. But I don't have a sort of satisfactory answer for the animal welfare folks. Apologies.
Yeah, and one final question. Do you see any potential in these techniques to improve food security pre a 10% catastrophic shock?
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to the preparedness element we were talking about. So I guess some of the components we've been looking at are around making sure that we have the trials in place to generate these kinds of these crops, but also making sure that we are putting the investments where they need to be in certain parts of the food system, so we have that resilience built in to those certain sectors. So obviously the animal agriculture sector is going to be a big part of this. There needs to be those pieces. Sort of the government needs to be putting them first, in the sense to make sure that we are controlling for those kinds of risks and making sure that they abide by the policies necessary to feed everybody. But overall, I think there's a broader piece that pushes the resilient foods I just mentioned, which involves targeted finance and investment for those infrastructures needed to scale those up in short time frames, sort of a year or less. Ideally, sort of 6 to 8 months, we'd want these foods scaled up to a level where they can be exported and significantly contribute to the percentage of calories that humans are consuming globally. So I guess there are a number of moving parts to that piece, and we're still exploring how we can build alliances to better encapsulate some of the changes that are required industrially, particularly for those industrial food solutions like cellulosic sugar and leaf protein concentrate, which could be very much churned out at high scale when we need them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a reminder, there's a talk in this room after this and multiple other talks around the venue, but can we give Noah a final round of applause?